There is a place in the world that millions of people have been forced into. They've been confined there by foreign invaders who have occupied their land and proclaimed themselves its owners. They have been expelled from their homes and walled into a tiny strip of land where basic aspects of their lives are carefully controlled and regulated by the invaders. Heavily armed guards patrol the perimeter, which is dotted with checkpoints, where nothing and no one gets in or out without the occupier's approval. The supply of basic services like water and electricity is controlled by this invader, who even carefully regulates the amount of food that their victims are allowed to eat. They are subject to periodic terror bombardments that kill hundreds, if not thousands, every time. Everyone lives knowing that their house could be leveled with themselves in it at any moment. Everyone, without exception, has multiple family members who have been killed by the invader, and dozens, if not hundreds, of dead friends or acquaintances. Many of them can even see the sites where their parents or grandparents' villages once stood from vantage points within their prison. The occupier has since handed this land over to settlers who seem to have no qualms with the fact that it's stolen, or that their victims are confined to a concentration camp just kilometers away. Yet somehow, among the world's foremost superpowers and much of its most influential media, it's not the people forced at gunpoint into the world's largest ever concentration camp who are thought of as victims with a righteous cause. It's the invaders and occupiers who expelled them from their homes, from their land, and who now keep them jailed. The advanced weapons of war that they employ against their victims are paid for by said superpowers with a smile. I am, of course, talking about the Gaza concentration camp in Palestine, where millions of Palestinians have been confined since being ethnically cleansed from their land and homes by racial fascist settler colonists who call themselves Israelis. Imagery on the screen unrelated. It's always interesting to see the spin on the Israeli occupation of Palestine, both by the Israelis themselves, who are obviously incentivized to say the dumbest bullshit imaginable, given that they're desperate to somehow justify the fact that they live on land that they stole from others. And the partisans for their superpower allies will gladly defend the settler colonial state of Israel to the death, for no reason other than the fact that it serves their geopolitical interests in the Middle East. They might pretend to be outraged at something that Israel does every now and again, but ultimately, they share all the same goals as the former group: to ensure the continued occupation of Palestinian land by the ethno-fascists who stole it, regardless of what this means for the imprisoned and occupied population that they stole it from. And they'll do everything possible to avoid having to answer the obvious questions that anyone uninitiated and observant is going to be asking about recent events. Like, wait, so why is there a massive wall around this tiny bit of land in the first place? If this is a war, then how does one side just have the ability to, at will, shut down the other side's electricity and water supply? Doesn't that sound a bit more like a prison break? Their spin always requires a feigned collective amnesia, where more than a century of context is removed, in order to somehow frame Israel as actually being a victim of its victims, whose actions simply happen in a vacuum without any cause and effect, beyond them, by implication, just sort of naturally being violent and hateful. Apparently, it's not completely and totally expected that in a population that has been oppressed on the basis of their ethnicity for most of their entire lifetimes, some might be driven to extreme actions. Or perhaps there's more to it. Perhaps after more than 40 years of occupation, of suffering, of oppression, some people might push back. Perhaps, for example, due to the embarrassing incompetence of the oppressor's military, many of whom have voluntarily chosen to move from their own rich home countries in order to violently oppress Palestinians and steal their land firsthand, some of your victims might somehow actually manage to break out of the prison that you've kept them in, using some, well, very rudimentary methods. Like, seriously. And when given that opportunity, when they step foot on the lands of their parents and their grandparents for the very first time, when they find their ancestral villages demolished, occupied by settlers who've built country clubs over them, they might just show you exactly the same amount of mercy and restraint that you have shown them over the last 70 years. Zero. Hamas's methods are certainly brutal, senseless, and counterproductive. Strategically, they've probably achieved absolutely nothing, but they're also wholly expected. If you'd grown up in the same situation, you might also have been driven to join one of the only groups that still fights back. And you might also have been filled with such rage for what has been done to you and your people that you would not be very nice to those you find occupying your land. Or raving on it. Yes, they were holding a rave a few kilometers from the Gaza prison walls. I shit you not. There's a certain point where you're just kind of gloating about what you're doing, and that is it. And it has to be intentional, because I really do not think it's possible to just not be conscious of the fact that you're raving right next to the world's biggest currently operating concentration camp. I wonder if back in the 19th century, Americans also held dance parties next to Indian reservations? Or maybe the Germans held them outside their concentration camps? Like, Jesus Christ, what the hell? And all of you understand all of that perfectly fine. Because everyone who performatively denounces the Palestinians driven to violence by their colonizers would gladly say everything that I just said about other actors in other similar situations. And many of them are in fact saying it right now in regards to Ukrainian and even wider European hatred of Russians. Every week, the Ukrainian government just can't help but post a soldier wearing some Nazi insignia, and every week there's 100,000 people explaining how that's actually fine because the Russians made this happen. Many of those who will doubtlessly be enraged at this video love to frame the American troops who voluntarily signed up to go and destroy Iraq and Afghanistan as helpless victims, forced into committing such actions by circumstance. They just desired to escape poverty, and what they did was no fault of their own. Yet those same people think the exact opposite of the Palestinians in Gaza, who are driven to join Hamas by their own infinitely worse circumstances. And those situations also aren't even remotely analogous either, because the American, when joining the military, isn't even fighting his own oppressors, his own government. Rather, he's shipped off to the other side of the world to oppress some of the world's poorest and most downtrodden people for them in exchange for payments. So they should be even more understanding of how someone could be driven by Israel to join Hamas if they're already so willing to frame an American soldier as a victim, but they aren't. They clearly pick and choose. And the reason there's no consistency is clearly because these conclusions are not drawn based on principles. They're simply based on a cynical desire to find some roundabout way to back the West in every situation, no matter what. So you get these clear and obvious contradictions that they'll jump through hoops trying to explain away, ultimately failing embarrassingly. As much as many of these people love to frame Palestinians as some sort of natural-born anti-Semites, the fact of the matter is that they've been dispossessed, murdered, ethnically cleansed, imprisoned, and occupied by people who exclaim, openly and proudly, to be doing all of that in the name of a certain ethnicity and religion. In a situation like that, it's expected that many victims would come to hate the same facets of their oppressors' identities that said oppressors themselves choose to emphasize to justify their atrocities. If Palestine had instead been colonized by Mormons who loudly told everyone they were doing what they were doing in the name of Mormonism, you would hear nothing about supposed Palestinian anti-Semitism today. There's this great moment from a recent Knowing Better video about the US colonization and genocide of Native Americans.
Pretty understandably, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and several other Plains nations were no longer interested in calls for peace by the Americans and began raiding wagon trains, cutting telegraph wires, and scalping settlers. Yes, I just said I understand why they scalped settlers. How could you not? Why is it that when we do it, it's an honest misunderstanding caused by a few bad apples, but when they do it, they're uncivilized, bloodthirsty savages? We were the ones killing women and children and making hats out of their body parts. Wouldn't you retaliate?
This is perfectly applicable to Hamas's recent incursion into occupied Palestine. They escaped from the Gaza reservation and attacked the soldiers and settlers who they found on the very front of the colonial frontier, living on Palestinian land and in Palestinian homes, just as the Indians who Knowing Better talked about also did. He understands it. He understands why it happened, why oppressed people undergoing a straight-up colonial genocide might be pushed into doing something that is clearly so brutal to other human beings. This is not a justification, of course, nothing even close to it. Rather, it's a sort of, well, what the hell do you expect? And how couldn't he understand that? How couldn't any of us? It's a simple question of cause and effect, and the cause is completely obvious. It takes a lot of courage for someone to say something like that about US history on an American platform with a largely American audience, many of whom tend to be offended by such obvious facts about their country's history. And it would take even more courage to recognize how that same exact logic very obviously applies to Palestinians, and say something like that today, rather than just taking the safest possible routes and treating the situation as if it's some sort of historyless vacuum, and standing with Israel, like every spineless liberal is currently doing, like standing with Nazi Germany after the bombing of Dresden. Give me a break. Unfortunately though, like many others, knowing better's courage begins and ends in the past. He can't bring himself to blame Israel for causing this inevitable backlash from its victims on its literal colonial frontier, as he blames American settlers for causing backlash against themselves back then. He would rather just retweet some of this platform's most despicable Zionists acting in the exact same way that I outlined earlier, as if there's no history, no context, no colonialism, as if there's not very clear and obvious reasons why something like this would happen that are wholly to blame on the settler colonial state of Israel and its settler colonists. This removal of context is the exact same sort of strategy that racists use when they point to black crime statistics, ignoring the whole poverty caused by centuries of oppression thing to try and imply that this is caused by something innate to the people themselves, rather than by some sort of obvious social cause. In that case, poverty, and in the case of the recent Hamas attacks, well, the fact that they are people confined to a literal concentration camp by a settler colonial invader? Hamas is a symptom, not a cause. The cause is the ongoing colonialism. It's a wonder that people can see so many stories in the Western media mourning the deaths of dual citizens from first world countries who moved to Israel, many of which were actually soldiers on active duty, and be like, oh, that's so sad, rather than, wait, what the hell? They're voluntarily moving to Palestine to settle on stolen land and join the occupation army and shoot at Palestinians? That sounds like colonialism. Quite often, the Nazis would frame attacks on their troops and settlers as terrorism. Of course, devoid of the context of them, carrying out genocides and colonizing the desperate groups of people who were attacking them. And you know what? Maybe they were terrorists. Maybe that is actually an accurate descriptor for them under some or some other definition. And maybe that's because the word terrorism sucks balls. I don't care, because I'm not going to go tut-tutting at genocide victims who didn't abide by the rules of war when they confronted Nazi settlers on their own land and in their own homes. Terrorist is clearly a completely useless announcement when it's being used to describe the inevitable backlash to oppression, yet somehow not the infinitely worse oppression that caused that backlash in the first place. This is clear in the fact that those presently using that word are invariably only using it for the former. If you wanted what I just described to stop back then, what you did was to stop the Nazis. And if you want the same to stop now, what you do is to stop Israel. It's that simple. But YouTuber Dylan Burns has a better suggestion. What if the people in the concentration camp just instead created a thriving civil society? You see, the problem is not the colonialism. It's not that they're jailed in the world's largest open-air prison by their occupier and periodically bombed by them. It's not that they've been deprived of their land on an ethnic basis. It's that they are not following liberal ideals well enough. If only they created a civil society in a fucking concentration camp, then they could show the path to a Palestinian state, which for Dylan doubtlessly means surrendering all of their occupied land and homes to their occupiers. If Ukraine was conquered by Russia, the remaining Ukrainians forced into one small tract of land, one could not imagine someone like this ever prescribing such a ridiculous solution to their oppression. I like to think that they're smart enough that they're saying this sort of impossibly stupid stuff on purpose to mislead people, and that they're actually fully aware of just how idiotic it is, though in Dylan's case, maybe not. It's not fashionable for those appropriating a leftist aesthetic to outright admit that they support Israel. So people like this and others instead engage in what I like to call Zionism with extra steps, where they feign sympathy and support for Palestine, but put the onus on the Palestinians themselves to implement solutions that are either batshit insane and obviously impossible, like the one that we just went over, or that clearly suit Israeli aims far more than Palestinian ones, like the failed musician Lonabox, who claims to support Palestinian liberation, yet insists that Palestinians should give up their land to their colonizers, while also curiously making videos about how Ukraine should retake Crimea, even if it means nuclear war.
Okay, how do we do it then? Without a BDS, we're going to BDS Israel, a nuclear power, into just giving up all its borders.
Wow, I wonder why he's applying totally different standards here. Actually, I'm not wondering at all. I know why. I've already told you why. I'd like to end this video by noting that the settlements attacked by Hamas are built on the rubble of ethnically cleansed Palestinian villages and farmland, and occupied by settlers who stole that land after their populations were expelled to Gaza. The city of Sderot, with its bustling country club, was built on the Palestinian village of Najad, which was ethnically cleansed of all Palestinians in 1948. The city of Ashkelon was built on Al-Majdal, a town of 10,000 Palestinians, all of whom were expelled to Gaza. Ofakim was built on the ruins of a Palestinian Bedouin village, its population ethnically cleansed and expelled to Gaza. The kibbutz in the area were built expressly with military and colonial aims in mind. They were intentionally built right next to Gaza by the most extreme of the extremist settlers, integral parts of the Israeli settler colonial project, to secure the frontier against their victims in Gaza. One has to wonder at what point this claim to civilian status becomes blurred. When you choose to live on the colonial frontier, on land that you stole, in settlements specifically designed to be the first line of defense against possible breakouts from a concentration camp. It is more than a little bit ridiculous to expect the people who were expelled from the very land that you're occupying to treat you with anything less than the contempt that you must feel for them, to have chosen to move there in the first place. Many of you could only possibly say the things that I'm saying here in retrospect. You might swear up and down that you love John Brown, that you'd have been on the right side of the Haitian slave rebellion, that you'd have had no part of the Indian Wars. But given that all it took for you to send thoughts and prayers to Israel and tut-tut on social media to anyone remotely to the left of the average liberal Zionist is one single instance of an oppressed people pushing back with all the rage that obviously is going to entail, I don't think that you would have been on the right side. I think you would have gotten squeamish when John Brown started shooting slave owners. I think you would have called for Haitian blood once you found out what they'd been doing to their slave owners. And I don't think you'd be quite as understanding about it as knowing better was when you heard the news about the scalp settlers on the American colonial frontier. After all, not even knowing better himself really is. It's a lot easier to wait centuries for the benefit of hindsight than it is to really take a stand in the present. To not let yourself get baited into the game of performative denouncements, of imperial superpower narratives that aim to frame the fascist colonizer as somehow morally above their oppressed victims, regardless of how popular such narratives might be. There are no perfect victims, and it's ridiculous to act like you expect there to be. If you push people around, some people push back. It's a basic adage, very simple to understand, very common sense. Everyone agrees with that. Yet some of us like to pretend not to whenever it's convenient. Hey guys, so this is me from the future here now. I just want to add a bit here about the way that so many supposed Palestine-supporting progressives are just so willingly lapping up Israeli propaganda. Case in point, the Vorsh subreddit heavily upvotes this post about how Hamas supposedly beheaded 40 babies. What is the source for this claim that they are uncritically upvoting? Well, a reporter for the I-24 Israeli propaganda news network just stated randomly with no evidence whatsoever that a soldier had told her that they had found 40 beheaded babies. Then Benjamin Netanyahu picked it up and started saying the same thing. Then Benjamin Netanyahu said that to Joe Biden, and Joe Biden, the president of the USA, did what the presidents of the USA always do, and he lied and claimed that he had personally seen images of Hamas beheading babies. The White House then came out and clarified that Biden actually had not seen anything of that sort. He was just going off hearsay told to him by Benjamin Netanyahu, a Hitler-like figure who's obviously just going to make shit up. And he extrapolated that and just decided to lie and say that he had seen images of this himself. Now, this is literal Goebbels tier propaganda. If you believe anything that any Israeli media outlet, any Israeli official says about anything uncritically without seeing any evidence for it yourself, you are exactly the sort of people who lapped up the Nazi propaganda in Der Stürmer. And the only reason that you can so easily believe this sort of stuff is because you are a racist, because you really believe this about the victims of Israeli genocide, because you really want to believe it, because any sort of critical use of your critical thinking faculties is going to cause you to be like, hey, maybe I shouldn't trust what the Israeli state says about this. Maybe I shouldn't trust what Israelis say about this. Maybe I shouldn't trust what the people doing genocide say about their genocide victims in order to justify doing genocide to them more. The source for that claim is literally nothing but one single Israeli propagandist whose job it is to drum up hatred of Palestinians to justify Israeli genocide of Palestinians. And you eat that up. Unbelievable. Another case in point. It's become like common knowledge now among these sorts of people that Hamas are committing like mass rape of every single person they see. What's the source for this? Literally nothing. Israeli media just started saying it because that's what they do. They make shit up in order to justify their genocide. And these progressive, nuanced, both sides people, of course, jump straight onto it, believing it uncritically, even though since then, many outlets have come out and said, well, actually, there's no evidence for this. Even the literal Israeli occupation forces straight up said that they are not going to even try to verify these claims. They're not confirming or denying them. Of course, because they didn't happen and they want plausible deniability when it comes out that they didn't. You have to be an utterly depraved, racist, just abhorrent and disgusting individual to just straight up believe this Goebbels tier propaganda. If you believe this, you would have been a Nazi if you were in 1930s Germany. You would have lapped up all the propaganda uncritically. It really is that simple. I'm just in utter disbelief at the pure willingness to believe a straight up genocidal power's propaganda about its victims. You know who is actually verifiably mass murdering children? Israel. Of course, 260 already, and that's already an outdated figure. It's from 1 or 2 days ago. By the time you're watching this, it's probably already gone up. Maybe you shouldn't uncritically believe what the child massacrists say about others massacring children. It's pure projection. It's, as I said at the very beginning of this video, it is the oppressor, the genocider, trying to frame their victims as actually somehow aggressing upon them, trying to frame themselves as their victims and thus further justify what they do to them. And it's so obvious too. Why do you need to be told this? What is wrong with you people? Anyway, so yeah, sorry that there's no supporter credits in this video. This is just something that I wanted to get out really quickly to comment on current events. But don't worry, they will be in the next video, which is going to be a video about the Iraq War, and we're going to be completely destroying the horrible YouTuber Kraut in the process of talking about it. So that's going to be fun. Be on the lookout for that. Yeah, just wanted to get this out very quickly. Kind of half-assed, but you know, sometimes that's the way that things have to be if you want to get them out in a timely fashion. Anyway, see you soon. Bye.